Do what thou will be the whole piece of law.
I know why you clicked on this video. Either you agree with the general sentiment, you already know what this book is, or third of all, you have no idea and we're just curious. So, first of all, thank you. Second of all, this is a bit of a different tonal video than I normally do. If you like this, I'm sure you'll like my other stuff. If you don't like this, don't worry, we'll get back to the normal stuff soon. But this is something that I've been kind of cooking on the back burner for a while. I just came off of recording all the other clips for this video, and it's going to be way longer than I thought it was. So we're just going to run with it. And I think it's a really good message. It's especially applicable. But before we start, and I explain what you're going to watch, my recommended consumption for this video is put it on while you're doing something else. There will be visual editing. I will keep you visually engaged, I hope. But the main goal of this is just for me to talk to you. It's great for second monitor gaming, and that is my recommended consumption. Secondly, I would appreciate if you liked, comment, and subscribed. It's very simple. Just hit the 4 buttons, you know what to do. So, all that business out of the way. Business. Anyway, what is this video about? At the very root of it, I'm covering a book called War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. Now, what is this book about? Or, first of all, how did I find out about this book to begin with? Because there's actually a little bit of a story to it. If you play Hearts of Iron 4, wow, I'm outing myself, what a big surprise. Smedley Butler is a very common and prominent alt history figure, especially for a lot of the left-leaning / communist paths. And I was wondering why. Why do people care so much about Smedley Butler? And I looked into him, and he's known for 2 things. One, let me give you a little skit, because there is a record of him saying it. So I'm going to give you a little skit. I'm going to put myself into Smedley Butler's voice, and I'm going to summarize it, because the video that he does is not really good at explaining it. So I'm going to give you my own version. All right, Smedley Butler mode. So you see, I was approached by a bunch of business leaders, and these business leaders told me that they wanted me to lead a faction of around 500,000 men and take over the US government and impose a dictatorship. I, of course, was against this. They picked the wrong guy. And now I feel it is my civic duty to tell you, the American people, I believe in all of your freedoms, and dictatorship cannot exist without them. So that's effectively what he said. The second thing he's most famous for is this book that he wrote after the war was over. It's a speech adapted to a book because he expanded the written version of the speech to a book with, I think, 6 sections, or I'll put the correct number up on screen. And he's known as a very staunch anti-war advocate. Now, this is odd because he's a 2nd Brigadier General. Also one of the only generals after the Civil War to be arrested, but that was for something super minor. He apologized, it got demoted to a reprimand. It was effectively nothing, but this book is what he's known for. I'm not going to say whether you've read it or not, but I'll tell you that people who boil it down to this is the guy who predicted the military-industrial complex are like 20% right. And before or after, depends, you don't necessarily need the context, I'm about to explain it all to you, but I would read it. I feel it's very valuable, especially to the modern day. The stuff he says 100 years ago is still applicable right now, and I'm going to highlight those facts in explicit detail because the original writing is just so powerful. You'd think he's out of touch because he's so high up on the political scale. No, he talks like these could just be put on TikTok and it could just be propaganda on its own. Not even propaganda, just good advice. So, as an example, the beginning of the book is called War is a Racket, and I felt it would be dishonest or non-fulfilling to not listen to the entire thing. I'm just going to read out the first section of the book. If it sounds interesting, I would read the rest of it, because the rest of it is written like this, and I'll intersperse little clips of me reading it, but you're gonna lose a lot of the overall feel, because he's a very powerful writer and a very powerful speaker. But, without further ado, War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the one international in scope. It is the only one in which profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few, at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. In the World War, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the World War. That many admitted their huge blood gains in their income tax returns. How many other war millionaires falsified their income tax returns? No one knows. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug in a trench? How many of them know what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened knights, ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried the bayonet thrust of an enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? Out of war, nations acquire additional territory. If they are victorious, they just take it. This newly acquired territory promptly is exploited by the few, the self-same few who wrung dollars out of blood in the war. The general public shoulders the bill. And what is this bill? This bill renders a horrible accounting, newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression, and all of its attendant miseries, back-breaking taxation for generations and generations. For a great many years, as a soldier, I had a suspicion that war was a racket. Not until I retired in civil life did I fully realize it. Now that I see the international war clouds again gathering, as they are today, I must face it and speak out. Again, they are choosing sides. France and Russia met and agreed to stand side by side. Italy and Austria hurried to make the same agreement. Poland and Germany cast sheep's eyes at each other, forgetting, for the nonce, their dispute over the Polish corridor. The assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia complicated matters. Yugoslavia and Hungary, long bitter enemies, were almost at each other's throats. Italy was ready to jump in, but France was waiting. So was Czechoslovakia. All of them are looking ahead to war. Not the people, not those who fight and pay and die, only those who ferment wars and remain safely at home to profit. There are 40 million men under arms in the world today, and our statesmen and diplomats have the temerity to say that war is not in the making. Hell's bells! Are these 40 million men being trained to be dancers? Not in Italy, to be sure. Premier Mussolini knows what they are being trained for. He, at least, is frank enough to speak out. Only the other day, Il Duce, in international conciliation to the publication of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, said, and above all, fascism, the more it considers and observes the future and development of humanity, quite apart from the political considerations of the moment, believes neither in the possibility for the utility of perpetual peace. War alone brings up to its highest tension all human energy and puts the stamp of nobility upon the peoples who have the courage to meet it." Unquote. Undoubtedly, Mussolini means exactly what he says. His well-trained army, his great fleet of planes, and even his navy are ready for war. Anxious for it, apparently. His recent stand at the side of Hungary and the latter's dispute with Yugoslavia showed that, and the hurried mobilization of his troops on the Austrian border, the assassination of Dollfuss, showed it too. There are others in Europe to whose saber-rattling presages war, sooner or later. The leader of Germany, with his rearming of his country, and his constant demands for more and more arms, is an equal, if not greater, menace to peace. France only recently increased the term of military service for its youth from a year to 18 months. Yes, all over. Nations are camping on their arms. The mad dogs of Europe are on the loose. In the East, the maneuvering is more adroit. Back in 1904, when Russia and Japan fought, we kicked out our old friends, the Russians, and backed Japan. Our very generous international bankers were financing Japan. Now the trend is to poison us against the Japanese. What does the open door policy in China mean to us? Our trade with China is about 90 million a year. Or the Philippine Islands. We have spent about 600 million in the Philippines in the past 35 years. And we, our bankers and industrialists and speculators, have private investments there of less than $200,000. Then, to save that China trade of about $90 million to protect these private investments, of less than $200 million in the Philippines, we would be all stirred up to hate Japan and go to war. A war that might cost us tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives of Americans, and many more hundreds of thousands of physically maimed and mentally unbalanced men. Of course, for this loss, there would be a compensating profit. Fortunes would be made. Millions and billions of dollars would be piled up by a few. Munitions makers, shipbuilders, manufacturers, meat packers, speculators, they would fare well. Yes, they are getting ready for another war. Why shouldn't they? It pays high dividends. But what does it profit the masses? What does it profit the men who are killed? What does it profit the men who are maimed? What does it profit their mothers and sisters, their wives and sweethearts? What does it profit their children? What does it profit anyone except for the few whom war means huge profits? Yes, and what does it profit the nation? Take our own case. Until 1898, we didn't own a bit of territory outside the mainland of North America. At the time, our national debt was a little more than $1 billion. Then we became internationally minded. We forgot, or shunted aside, the advice of the father of our country. We forgot Washington's warning about entangling alliances. We went to war. We acquired outside territory. At the end of the World War period,
as a direct result of our fiddling in international affairs. Our national debt has jumped to over $25 billion. Therefore, on a purely financial bookkeeping basis, we ran a little behind year for year, and that foreign trade might well have been ours without the wars. It would have been far cheaper, not to say safer, for the average American who pays the bills to stay out of foreign entanglements. For a very few, this racket, like bootlegging and other underworld rackets, brings fancy profits, but the cost of operations is always transferred to the people who do not profit.
So, I hope that resonated with you, because I know it resonated with me and it's what made me want to cover it. I want to cover now some more ground information. Butler himself is a Marine, first of all, and second of all, served in basically every war after the Spanish-American War. He served in the Spanish-American War, then served in the Philippines, served in the Boxer Rebellion, served in a bunch of assorted wars in Central America, and was a major commander in World War I. To also put this more in perspective, he mentions a lot of people that you might know. And that's because this book was written in 1935. Everything he's going to say in this book about there's going to be another war, it's going to be awful, he's going to be like 99% correct. I think the only thing he's wrong about is chemical weapons, but we'll get there. The first chapter really just... it makes him sound like he's out of a poor man's Poison album. I tell you, right as I'm recording this, I'm listening to Let's Go, and that's effectively what this book is. If you just listen to that song and read the book, you are getting in the right mood. Anyway, great song. Listen to it if you have the time. But this section is who makes the profits. And, sorry, one more tacked on thing. I want to discuss this in the sense of the actual opinions of the book. If I sound invested, it's not because it's my actual political opinions. He's going to say a lot of things that are controversial, to put it light, and I want to discuss it from his lens. All of this is from his lens. None of this is my personal opinion. It just makes it easier for me to discuss it if we can agree that that's the case. Unless I say it's my personal opinion, it is strictly Smedley Butler's attitude in this book that I can glean from it, as he's no longer around for me to ask him. So, who makes the profits? The first part of this chapter is just him putting the debt into perspective, saying that it's just the war has cost $52 billion. And he says with the current population, this is $400 of debt for every American man, woman, and child. Now, if you're personally wondering what our debt clock sets at, it is currently at $37 trillion. At time of recording. That means the debt per citizen, man, woman, and child, as Smedley Butler says, is $109,256. I don't know about you, but that is more money than I have seen in my entire life. And with inflation, it's still an insane amount higher than it was back then, even proportionally. In case you're wondering what the debt per taxpayer would be, it is $324,123. If you're an average American, I know you don't have that kind of money. He then proceeds to do what a bunch of people love to do in the modern day. You know, whenever something bad happens, they say their names, or name the accuser. Like, who's responsible for all of this? You know, when you make big generalizations and say, who's responsible for all this? He just right out and says it. He says, DuPont, first of all, DuPont gunpowder, because now they do chemicals, but they used to just do gunpowder. And then he names a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't think about. Well, a bunch of stuff you would think about and wouldn't think about. Like, for example, you say steel companies profit off of war, no one would bat an eye. You say copper or leather or nickel. That's a bunch of common war industries. You know, you need bullets, you need tanks, you need planes, you need a bunch of stuff. But then he starts getting into the weird things. He names all of these profits in sugar and shoes and saddles because, you know, leather has to be remade. They have all this spare leather. Where are they going to put it? Let's put it in saddles. There's still saddles sitting around today. Mosquito netting, airplanes and engines, which were never used, by the way. The airplane companies just wanted theirs, so says Smedley Butler. Ships, undershirts, stockings, uniforms, wrenches, which are only fit to 2 Niagara Falls, and buckboards. All these things, he just says, these companies made bare minimum 200% profits. War is the most profitable industry in the entirety of human existence. And he also brings up a lot about Liberty bonds and how people get scammed out of fear to sell these cheaply, and bankers who have the money to buy them up still get to just buy it because, you know, what does it matter if I lose a couple? Like, he says they're selling them for like $16 down, and he buys them back and they sell them for double once the war is over. And he also calls out a weird document This document is called Senate Document Number 259. Now you may ask, what is the importance of this? Why does Smedley Butler care? Well, this is a report that deals with corporate earnings and government revenues, and it considers the profits of tons of corporations, like 122 meat packers, 153 cotton manufacturers, 299 garment makers, steel plants, coal, and profits under 25% were exceptional. For example, like he says, coal companies made between 100% and 7,856% on their capital stock during the war. He also says meat packers in Chicago tripled their earnings to begin with, and that's just the minor ones. That's not speaking generally in the sense of, all these people make ridiculous profits. He also mentioned it in the beginning, but he reiterates it here. Remember that over 21,000 people were made millionaires and billionaires off of the $16 million in profits. And if you do the math on that, hold on, let me do the math for you real fast. That's an average of $7,600, and we'll round down, $19. That's in 1935 money, but to be fair, he's also writing after the Great War, which is, let's just give him credit, say 1918 money. That's $7,619. Do you know how much that is? In 1918 money, according to the U.S. inflation calculator, $7,619 is worth $163,468 per person. And this is just from the war alone. This is just him saying, this is what they get for participating. This isn't even accounting for all the other side benefits you get for working for Uncle Sam. And he's a lot more explicit. He actually goes in and says, this is the economics, these are the profits, these are insane. Because he says this is all money. You don't account for the real cost. You don't have any plans to limit losses. All these committees just trouble themselves with money. It's all about money. They never consider the human element. Because he goes on to say, quote,
Apparently, however, the plan does not call for any limitation of losses. That is, the losses of those who fight in the war. As far as I have been able to ascertain, there is nothing in the scheme to limit a soldier to the loss of but one eye, or one arm, or to limit his wounds to 1 or 2 or 3, or to limit the loss of life. There is nothing in this scheme, apparently, that says not more than 12% of a regiment shall be wounded in battle, or that not more than 7% in a division should be killed. Of course, the committee cannot be bothered with such trifling matters.
I feel this is a perfect segue to lead into the next section, which is labeled Who Pays the Bills? Now, you may have a concrete answer in your mind. Well, paying bills, of course. It's the people who pay the taxes, the people who fuel the nation. And that's what Smedley Butler would also say. People who got conned into buying bonds, or, people who have to shoulder the debt. But the most apparent is the soldiers. He has a wonderful quote, which I apologize that I'm quoting back to back, but it says it from a soldier's perspective that I don't have. I want to say that this is true. To the best of my knowledge, this is true, because it leads us into what Smedley Butler will then continue to criticize. And this is not me saying it as a soldier. This is my voice giving to life Smedley Butler's experience as a soldier. He says, quote,
Boys with a normal viewpoint were taken out of the fields, and offices, and factories, and classrooms, and put into the ranks. They were remolded. They were made over. They were made to about face, to regard murder as the order of the day. They were put shoulder to shoulder, and, through mass psychology, they were entirely changed. We used them for a couple of years, and trained them to think nothing at all of killing or being killed. Then suddenly, we discharged them, and told them to make another about face. This time, they had to do their own readjusting. Sans mass psychology, sans officers' aid and advice, sans nationwide propaganda. We didn't need them anymore, so we scattered them about without any 3-minute or Liberty Loan speeches or parades. Many, too many of these fine young boys are eventually destroyed, mentally, because they could not make that final about face alone.
Unquote. This is him talking about the abuse of veterans, something we deal with today in the United States and probably other countries abroad. It's one of the most lingering problems that nobody has solved yet. We want to give them all these bonuses in hiring. We want to give them all these excess benefits. They get the best healthcare in the nation. They get all these benefits after they come back from combat, or so I'm told. But they can't make that psychological about face. You know what an about face is in the Army? It's when you turn 180 degrees around. Smedley Butler is saying we need them to about face to what they need to do, get them trained in their task, and then we throw them back into civilian life where they have to make that final about face alone. They get no advice, they get no help, and we can't change them back. So what do? It's a question that we still haven't solved, or haven't solved to a acceptable degree, I feel Smedley Butler would say today, too. And he makes a big deal about conscription. As you could probably tell with what he describes in The Psychology of a Soldier, he's not a big fan of conscription. He just goes on about how people are there, but mentally they're gone. And this is the First World War where shell shock and all of these horrible maimings and thousands of mental cases where people just don't come back. And it's these people who continuously pay the bill, quote unquote. These people who are sentenced to live the rest of their lives wounded, psychologically or physically, and the dead as well. They've paid their bill, but those who are still paying the bill are those left behind. He also brings up an interesting point, and he addresses a lot of the people in the name of capital G God, or their God, or however you want to phrase it. Whatever higher power they worship is on both sides of this conflict. Both of these nations on the opposing sides of the war, he specifically brings up Germany, and he's talking from the United States. Specifically, they're both Christian nations. These are Christian on Christian conflicts, and both of them claim that they have capital G God on their side. And it's heartbreaking because he quotes Napoleon and says, "All men are enamored with decorations. They positively hunger for them." And he says this is just part of the propaganda. They hand out all these medals and awards, even though he's like super decorated, but I don't think that takes away from it. You might even be able to add to it and say he's super cynical about all these rewards that he's gotten. He feels like these are just fake, or worse, I suppose. They signify something that only has personal significance to him. He doesn't need to show it to anyone else. This is me interpolating. He doesn't need to show it to anyone else. He just knows that he did what he had to do. And he also then says, don't think that I'm just making this about the wishy-washy emotional stuff. We're also scamming them out of their money too, because there are a bunch of prizes for enlistment, and soldiers get $30 a day. And afterwards, after all that's taken away with insurances and paying for his own gear and all that other stuff, you're left with about $9 to spend on yourself, which is effectively like $100 to $200 today, which technically is more than some people, but I'm not going to make a comment on that one. And he says it's all propaganda. It's people accepted conscription because of the propaganda. And remember, soldiers bought $2 billion worth of those bonds at scam prices. And don't think it's just him, because remember, behind each person there's a family. So he's also saying the families are paying the price, the soldiers are paying the price. And he says everyone but the rich is paying this price. And I get it. I see why people are framing him in this light. I never knew. He lived through the first Red Scare, and it obviously didn't affect him. He did not make it to the second Red Scare, but I guarantee he would have been under super high suspicion, because he's going to make a lot of defenses later in the book that says none of this is un-American, which is the key phrase you hear during the Cold War. You know, the Council for Un-American Activities. That's what they called communists. Communists are un-American. And that's one of the main criticisms he tries to deflect. So now that he's got you immersed, he's explained how he believes. He then moves on to the next chapter, which is titled How to Smash This Racket. And this is where it gets a little more applicable to the modern day. As I start describing things, think how you could apply this to a modern context. Before I tell you, I'm going to tell you, but just think about it. He says, international organizations can't do this. This has to be a change in attitude of the entire United States population. This has to be a change in all of the people of the world. He proposes something that he doesn't name specifically, but just for a snappy name, I'm going to call this universal conscription, which is a month before you can conscript any soldiers or draw anyone to the front lines or deploy anyone anywhere. Everyone, and he means everyone from the people who run the coal factories down to the people who dig the coal out of the mines, makes $30 an hour, full stop. No other side benefits, no other additional incomes. You make $30 a month. I think I said hour before. $30 a month, and then only after a month of making $30 a month with no benefits, no additions, only then can you move to a plebiscite. If you don't know what a plebiscite is, think about it like a small council but with some more power, of anyone of conscription age to make a decision. And he doesn't say that it has to be a 2/3 majority or any other like unanimous, but if I had to put some words in his mouth, I'd say 66% of this plebiscite would have to vote to go to war. After this, everyone makes $30 a month, period. Full stop. And only then could you have a war. And he then says to go a step further and takes aim at a lot of the modern messaging that we would say. You never hear people say, oh, we need tanks to go roll over other nations, or we need these airplanes to go indiscriminately destroy other people's property. It's always, we need to defend ourselves. They're threatening our way of life. They're threatening our democracy. And he uses that phrase specifically, which brought it home. It brought all this home. And he's going to go into it more. I don't want to steal his thunder. But he says the military should only be used for truly defensive purposes and not this propaganda defense that people are using now. And he puts specific restrictions on where all military forces can move if he were to implement these policies, which I'm not going to stop him because he proposes a constitutional amendment that never passed, by the way, surprise, that he believes will end war. The next section is a little more pointed. Now this isn't how to smash this racket, it's to hell with war, a condemnation of war as a whole. And he's frustrated with the outcome of the election because he said Wilson was elected on a platform of not getting into the war. And I don't know how he voted, but I assume he voted for Wilson because of how angry this makes him. He says, oh, he changed his mind in 5 months due to all this money because of the profits of us sending stuff overseas. And there's a good quote that's coming up soon that I'm not going to steal the thunder of. And this is where he specifically states we need to make the world safe for democracy. And he says, that's the propaganda cry. We need to make the world safe for democracy. And he says, who cares? Why should we make the world safe for democracy? He says, why should we care how other people run their countries? We're just going to impose, a philosophical brain drain of ideas. He's effectively, spoiler for a future video, but he's effectively kind of taking the fourth political theory angle. He's saying, why do we care how other people are running their countries? Why do we care? It's of no interest to us. He says, who cares if they're authoritarian or communistic or democracy or a monarchy? We should only be concerned about preserving our democracy. We should be focused on defending what we have, not going out and doing regime change like they will in the future, especially during the Cold War. He doesn't foresee the Cold War, but I think it would have been interesting to see how he would have dealt with it, especially because he takes such a hardliner stance. And he says, oh, chemical weapons are going to be big, but that's just because he's coming off the First World War. Chemical weapons weren't really a big problem in the Second World War. They weren't even used, mainly because it was too impractical and war moved too fast. Chemical weapons really only work when you have a place to point them, and if the front line keeps changing, every day, you're not going to have a point to point at. And he just says, science is for the service of the war machine. All our science, no matter how pure of heart, is just made to make better weapons in the end. And he's kind of right. Disease treatments are just how to keep people, alive longer in horrible circumstances, or, this new way to stop bleeding for, women's personal use is now a way to fill those bullet holes. And he also condemns the fact that World War I wasn't really the end of all wars. He says nothing's been done. There's going to be a new one in the future. I mean, look at everything that's happening in the world in 1936 and onward. You played Hoi 4, you're seeing what Smedley Butler's seeing, and he basically predicts spot on what's going to happen. And he says, why is it our problem? Who cares? We've already spent so much time trying to invest it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And for this point, I want to move to common sense neutrality. Next chapter, where he foresees the U.S. intervention culture. I kind of got into it earlier, but this is where he says it, and I want to use a quote that I really like. And it sums it up really well. It's a good way of putting it, and I don't want to say I agree with him, but I understand where he's coming from, because it really sets his entire worldview up in a way that you can understand. Because in general, he's an anti-imperialist, isolationist, and if we have to intervene anywhere, you gotta put it to that plebiscite. And it can't be for any aggressive reasons. We're not gonna start any colonialist wars, which makes sense. Colonialism is on its downfall in this period in history, and it's gonna, full-blown collapse in the 1960s, but we're not there, and that's beyond the scope of this book. So, let's let Smedley Butler tell us a story about how he would explain his set of beliefs.
Suppose you were walking down a strange street, in a strange town, in a strange country, thousands of miles from your own home. You come across a brawl. You have no real interest in it. All of a sudden, you hear one of the brawlers cry out in your native tongue as he swats at his opponent, "I believe in democracy!" You don't know in the least what the fight is about, but your sympathies are at once with this fellow who speaks in your own language. The believer in democracy sees you hesitate and shouts, "Come on and get in! We believe in the same things! Also, don't forget, if this other fellow wins, you'll be next. You'd better come in now." You reply, "No, I don't want to. I'm a stranger, and I don't want to get mixed up in this. I like you, but not enough to get into a fight. I want to be neutral." "All right," he says, "be neutral, but you can gather up all the stones, clubs, and brickbats that you can get a hold of and sell them to me, and I'll use them on the other fellow." That's a swell way to be neutral, isn't it? Do you really think that if you start handing your Democratic friend ammunition, you won't get into it too? You can't help it. If he's losing, and if he wins, he will only call you a scab, said that he could have won by himself anyhow, and declare that he owes you nothing. He will also hate you, because you made money out of his necessity. So both sides will hate you. On the other hand, if you stay out of this fight, which you have nothing to do with in the first place, the argument that if the other fellow wins, he will give you a good beating too won't apply. You will have gone on with your own business, instead of butting into a fight where you did not belong. And better still, the winner won't find you right there on hand and ready to be chewed up next. You will be thousands of miles away, and he will have to come after you.
Unquote. Hey, does that story sound like any wars that have sprung up in the past 5 years? I know one comes to mind between, the United States' alleged greatest enemy and between the United States' alleged greatest ally, the Russo-Ukrainian War. You ever hear something about that? You need to defend democracy, and it's all about these power dynamics, and we have to defend them because of all this, like they give a long list of reasons why we have to defend Ukraine, or why we have to bash Russia, or why we have to do anything. But Smedley Butler says, screw those guys. Let them sort it out themselves. Why do we have to care? Why are we getting into it? Because, if we help one side or the other, they're both gonna hate us. If we stay out of it, no one hates us at all. But then I don't think he foresaw the mass communication downsides of, now it's an entire large issue on, it's a huge discussion on media angles and your allies, and he doesn't really see the formation of NATO as a really big deal, and I feel like it's different. But he's at a more base level describing what happened in World War I, because the United States tacitly supplies the United Kingdom and France with all the stuff they need, and they're slowly getting entangled, and their ships are getting sunk, and you may remember the Lusitania from class, and all of these ships with Americans on them are getting sunk, and it's an incident every single time, and the Kaiser has to go to America and say, please don't get involved, and Woodrow Wilson just makes it harder and harder each time. So there's some historians that say, oh, well, it's because Wilson wanted to get into the war, but he didn't want to force the United States to declare war, and other people say, like, oh, he's just doing this for positive reasons. But no matter how you slice it, the United States got into the war. Smedley Butler was right, and he's criticizing the United States for being so interventionist. I don't know how that would fly in the modern day, especially because isolationism as a concept in America is just not existent anymore. You find very fringe, niche communities or people that would hardcore advocate for isolationism, but synonymously in the zeitgeist right now, isolationism is in the same discussion as giving up the American empire, as Smedley Butler may call it. And then, not for his argument, but he goes into this next part of the book. He says, here's why we need a defensive army, because no one will be able to supply the logistical nightmare. And there's a quote from a general. I don't remember what the exact quote is or who the general is. If I find it while I'm editing, it'll be up on screen. But he says something along the lines of, divas think of strategy and tactics, real generals think of logistics. Because logistics is the most important thing. It is also the most important thing in Hoi 4. Wow, what a surprise. So he says it's logistically impossible for any European army to invade the United States. And he specifically says this in the context of Germany in the 1940s. He says, so what if Germany wins? They're never going to be able to logistically manage to do it. And here's why. Quote,
"For every man at the front, you must ship every day of the year from your home depot 1,000 pounds of supplies, food, ammunition, gasoline, clothing. medical supplies, engineering supplies, spare parts, etc., to say nothing of the replacements of the above. If you have 200,000 men at the front, you will have 800,000 men supplying them from the rear, and you will have to send them 100,000 tons of supplies every day. Remember also that for every 1,000 miles you go across water on an invading expedition into hostile land, you must take with you 90 days' stores of all kinds. It is over 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. 3 times 90 is 270 days. 9 months. No, the supply of a European army in America is out of the question. That is, an army big enough to land here.
Unquote. The rest of the chapter is just him going over why a naval invasion or an invasion by air or other senseless destruction from other angles is impossible because the United States is too far away from Europe to make any difference. He's basically saying that the United States should just abandon Europe to whatever fate that it's going to sort out for itself, and regardless of what it will be Europe's fate, without an American hand in it. Of course, Smedley Butler would not get his wish, and the United States would get involved in World War II. As Winston Churchill said in one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill, once all other options have been exhausted, you can count on the Americans to do the right thing, or something like that. Which clearly states that Churchill is for intervention, mainly because, I don't want to say he was staring down the barrel of losing the war, but he was staring down the barrel of probably not the best outcome for the Allies if the United States had not gotten involved. And finally, in this chapter, he lays out an appeal to the mothers, mainly saying you have to resist this propaganda, you have to resist the drumbeat of war. Nothing will make up for the loss of your family. Nothing will make up for the loss of the shattering of whatever's going to be brought about by a conflict. You need to remember this. Always. You have to, because it is with you that you can raise your children right. You can do all these things. You're the only people who can stop the drumbeat of war. And something that he also says near the end of this chapter, and this is where I'll let you guys debate it, he'll say, quote,
"If you let this country go into a European war, you will lose this democracy. Don't forget that."
I mean, did we? Did it come to pass? I know people like to be very hyperbolic nowadays about, oh, the election didn't go my way, I'm gonna do whatever, I'm gonna go to Canada, or I'm going to, I don't know, I mainly just hear the go to Canada, I'm gonna do something else, but the Republican version, I don't know, seethe in my own house, or, I don't know, my firearms cabinet, I don't know, you know, whatever you do when you lose an election, you know, if you're looking at this like sports teams, because I was just having a discussion with my friend about like, U.S. politics is just sports teams, you know, yell at screen when good, yell at screen when bad. And you can debate whether we've lost our democracy all you want. But Smedley Butler says concretely, if we get entangled in European affairs, we will lose it. And I don't know how he would look at it right now. I don't know what he would say. I'm not going to try and interpolate it. But just think about it. Even if you concretely don't believe that, even if you believe in intervention and you're not an isolationist, just think about it. Because it's logically consistent. He's saying that foreign entanglements, I could see him predicting the Cold War off of this. Mainly because of the preservation of democracy. How democratic do you have to be? At what point does it be used as a bludgeon? He says in that skit that I put in like at the very beginning of the video that he believes in the freedom to write, the freedom to speak, and I don't know how far he goes on those things. I'm not going to try and put words in his mouth. But just think about it. If you take one question away from this, put it in the comments. How do you think, what do you think of the statement, if you let this country go into a European war, you will lose this democracy, don't forget it. What do you think about that? Let me know, I'm curious. But he then goes on to the chapter, the Amendment for Peace, which I am going to read in full because it's the stuff that I've been skipping over. This is his big proposal. He's like, why don't we just put this into law and it'll solve everything, allegedly. So, he says, quote,
"I propose an amendment for peace to the Constitution of the United States. First, the removal of members of the land armed forces from within the continental limits of the United States and the Panama Canal Zone for any cause whatsoever is prohibited. Second, the vessels of the United States Navy or of the other branches of the armed service are hereby prohibited from steaming for any reason whatsoever except on an errand of mercy, more than 500 miles from our coast. Third, aircraft of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps is hereby prohibited from flying for any reason whatsoever more than 750 miles beyond the coast of the United States. Such an amendment would be an absolute guarantee to the women of America that their loved ones would never be sent overseas to needlessly be shot down in European or Asiatic or African wars that are of no concern to our people. Such an amendment, linked with adequate naval and military defenses at home, would guarantee everlasting peace for our nation.
Unquote. How do you sell that? Could you imagine what the modern United States would look like if this amendment were somehow passed into law, go through all the checks, and actually lands into the United States Constitution? This peace amendment goes through. What happens? The Cold War just doesn't happen. 90s doesn't happen. 2000s doesn't happen. All of this other stuff that is going to be quintessential American intervention, deposition of governments, throwing American boys in line of fire again, will just not happen. And it would effectively mean no American empire is ever established, because the establishment of what you know, or what Smedley Butler would describe as the American empire, is established with NATO and all these other treaties and agreements and the Marshall Plan and all these other post-World War II into the Cold War things to suppress communism and far beyond the scope of this video. What does he say in this section after the amendment for peace? He says, let's give up everything that isn't Alaska or Hawaii. Let's let go of Puerto Rico. Let's let go of Guam. Let's let go of the Philippines. Let's let go of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Let's let go of Midway. Let's let go of all these things. We don't need them. They're just going to get us into a bunch of other problems, and all these people already want to be independent anyway. So let's just be ahead of the trend, let them go.
But we should still keep Panama. That's like of vital importance. And I totally agree with him. Why did we ever sell Panama? I understand why, but it's of like vital U.S. strategic significance. Why did you ever get rid of it? Smedley Butler was 100% you don't get rid of Panama. And now BlackRock's gonna buy it or something.
Anyway, he then takes up the opposite side. He then wants to deconstruct how, with all this in place, you could still mess it up. Because he acknowledges that he's still a human, effectively. He's saying all of these are imperfect, and if I had to construct a situation where this would fall apart, here's how I would do it. He says, quote,
"These paths are neutrality, take the profit out of war, referendum on war, total disarmament, mass protests, education of the masses, student strikes, and Oxford oaths. Let us suppose that all the anti-war measures that have been proposed were passed by Congress and placed on our stature books. Let us suppose that all of America's youth of fighting age were to subscribe to the Oxford Oath against participation in war. This would not ensure the peace of our nation. Laws passed by Congress in 1 week can be wiped off the statute books the next week, and laws can be evaded. Take our neutrality measures, prohibiting the export of rifles, ammunition, and other products to nations at war. There are ways and means of evading such embargoes. Machine guns can be, as they have been in the past, whipped as sewing machines. Cannons can be camouflaged as locomotive parts, and with the necessary bribes, placed aboard ships. The proposed take the profit out of war bill could also be evaded by intricate financial jugglery, such as was common during the World War. And last, even the war referendum, the plebiscite to decide whether our people are to go to war or not, is not foolproof. Don't you suppose that the American people could be roused by skillful propaganda to vote for a war in which we have no interest, even if a hysterical Congress did not previously wipe the law from their books? Once the cannons begin booming and the drums begin rolling, red-blooded youth, despite its Oxford oaths, despite its mass protests, despite its satiric veterans of future wars, will succumb to the war clamor. Radio orators screaming their pet and smug phrases of war to end all war, and war to make democracy safe, and the newspapers shrieking in black headlines of war atrocities. These and similar propaganda arts of war makers would be invoked to break down the earlier opposition of America's youth to war. You think it impossible?
Unquote. The worst part is, I don't. And Smedley Butler ends the book by saying that it's the people's responsibility. The people must lead the way. And I understand now, finishing this, why people find this book so prophetic. He doesn't predict the military-industrial complex per se, but he says why it will be possible. Because he says war is the most profitable industry. So it would follow that a state of permanent war, or a state that you could not demobilize, which is how the military-industrial complex was created. There was something called the Revolt of the Admirals, where Truman had to make a critical decision of how to cut 70% of military funding. And I could do an entire video on this. Please let me know if you want to. The Revolt of the Admirals, Truman said he had to cut 70% from somewhere. And a lot of it was who can deploy nuclear weapons. And the Air Force came out on top. The Army is going to be the guys who moves the line forward on the map, and the Navy is left out there wherever. And they push back. They say effectively all these good reasons why, we should keep the Navy funded. And one of their reasons is they bring up the morality of nuclear weapons. They say, we're still going to fight conventional wars. They say, we're still going to engage in normal warfare because it's immoral to just say, oh yeah, we're going to resort to nuclear weapons because that's not how wars are fought anymore. You're really just going to say, oh yeah, we'll just nuke them if we ever go to war. Like, that's immoral. The Navy, by the way, and this isn't like common sailors, this is high people like Nimitz will go up and say, this is immoral that you're just going to go into wars just so you can nuke people. Of course, they'll, stop talking about it once they can mount nuclear weapons on submarines, but that's not the point about it yet. So Truman's caught in a bind, and he basically says, fine, we won't demobilize, we'll just keep everything as it is. And we'll keep spending more. Because if you follow Smedley Butler's logic, if you have a state of quote-unquote permanent war, that's the best for the corporations. And he's already stated, allegedly, by the way, major allegedly, that there's already been a planned coup by the corporations to depose the democratically elected United States government so they can institute a dictatorship. They just picked the wrong general. And it's frustrating because all of this is so applicable to the modern day and not enough people know about this book. You can find copies online. You can find a copy in print. It's not even that long. It's 35 pages at most, like 25 if you want to just say, oh, let's cut out whatever that stupid guy with the PhD has to say about it. And you just want to read what Smedley Butler said. It's like 25 pages. It's not that bad. You can sit down, you can read it in like 30 minutes to an hour, and I guarantee it's one of the best reads you will have, especially if you're super interested in politics. Once again, I want to reiterate, I don't want to make this a political video. This is not me making a political video. I don't want to make any concrete stances about politics. That's not what my channel is about. I want to talk about crazy people and history, if I can, crazy people related to history. And this is just one of those books that I feel not enough people know about. It's a book that can describe history really, really well, and it's super applicable despite the time it was written in. The ideologies mentioned in the book, communism, monarchy, fascism, are all dead in large swathes of me generalizing it. You may be able to say, well, communism's alive in these organizations, or fascism is alive in these organizations, or what about that group in Germany that wants to overthrow the government and put in the monarch again from House Hohenzollern? And I'd say none of those people really matter in the grand scheme of things. No communist movement is big enough besides China to make a impact on the world, but they're kind of doing their own thing. It's not, well, I don't even want to get into it. They're doing their own thing, and there are no fascist governments left in the world, well, unless you want to count all that. There are no explicitly fascist governments in the world, and there are no influential monarchies in the world, mainly because I think Bhutan still has a monarchy, or like the UK is technically still a monarchy, but it's only for ceremonial purpose. There are no absolute monarchies left. It's mainly just democracy left. This is mainly setting up a video that I really want to do in the future and that I don't want to take too much wind out of my sails. But I'd listen to Smedley Butler. He says a lot of valuable things, even if you, for some reason, are a colonialist, or for some reason are an interventionist, or for some reason are the opposite, and you totally agree with him. You should listen to him anyway, regardless of who you are, even if you're pro-war. I don't know anyone who's pro-war, but if you're pro-war, you should read this book. If you're anti-war, you should read this book. Just read the book. It's not too long of a read. It's super easy. Just look it up. It's super easy to find. It's not hard. It doesn't require any technical knowledge. And it's such an engaging read. You are doing yourself a disservice by not reading it. And that's all I have to say on the matter. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching. I want to once again remind you that you should like, comment, and subscribe, especially if you made it this far. I do a lot of content. I make stuff every week. Well, I try. But I've kept to it so far, so if that accounts for anything, I really appreciate you making it this far. I know only like 10% of people do. And just remember, war is a racket.